Hi there. This is my review of Star Wars Andor, Season 1. It's a podcast, audio-only review, so you can leave this on the background while you're doing stuff, driving, whatever. My channel is focused on the Game of Thrones franchise, covering House of the Dragon. I don't normally review other things, but Andor was really great. That you may have heard that critics are raving about it, but the viewership was relatively low, and assumed, oh, they're fanboying out about some lore thing or whatever. No, the hype is completely justified. It's that good. It's arguably the best TV show of the year, period. Much less a Star Wars project, though it serves the core themes of Star Wars very well. Now, I wasn't able to watch it because I was busy with post-season catch-up for House of the Dragon Season 1, so I marathoned it as soon as Christmas break started, and it blew me away. I thought this was, fanboy hype. No, it is that good. You might be surprised to hear me say, well, it's the best show of the year, well, more than House of the Dragon. As a TV show, maybe, because if I had to list off the top 3 TV shows of the year, it would be House of the Dragon, Neil Gaiman's Sandman, and Andor, but those other 2 are adaptations, which inherently means that an original TV project, a born TV project like Andor, has that advantage. It works better as TV because it was conceived of as TV. Whereas House of the Dragon, I like the underlying story a lot, but they have to cram so much in, and they did a good job given the difficulty of the task. It's hard to do. And Sandman also, that they're transferring from a graphic novel to a TV format. So they're not as good as TV shows because they're trying to do something harder as an adaptation. So I don't think you can even compare them. But yes, as a pure TV show, Andor probably worked better because it was conceived of as a TV show. So I felt bad that I wasn't watching it originally because I was busy with the other stuff, and I wanted to do my small part encouraging my own followers and subscribers. If you haven't watched this, you need to watch it. I know there's bigger Star Wars channels out there and stuff. I'm not like an influencer or anything, but if you haven't, you need to. And if you have seen it, you probably want to hear my thoughts on it if you're one of my followers anyway, of just to put in context, what did I think made it a good show? So this review is appealing to both sides of that. If you have seen it, if you haven't, there will be mild spoilers, but there aren't giant lore drops in it or anything. So I will mention things that happen. I'm not really hiding anything. Like you can see from trailers, they have this raid that they conduct, and then later he gets captured and he's in a prison and has to escape. That's in the trailers. So I'll be talking about that, but that's just on a general level. I'm not going to say who lives and dies from the second-tier characters or anything like that, but it doesn't really matter for the points I'm trying to cover here. I wasn't aiming for 7 points. It ended up being 7 points, but the major points about it shows them functioning like a real insurgency. I broke that down into sub-points, but they're all one big thing, that like some points are bigger than others. Like Point 6 and 7 at the end are just afterthoughts. If there's 1 or 2 criticisms I had, if I would paste it a little differently, but they're not equal points. But I'll go through in just the order that it comes up. So, 4 minutes into this, diving in. Point 1. Generally, Andor is the most political Star Wars TV show ever, probably the most political they've been since the prequel movies. Because it's not about space battles or the Force. There's no mention of Jedi in it. There's Easter eggs and stuff. Someone shows a kyber crystal in an antiquities thing, but they don't mention the Jedi. The Emperor is never on screen, and he's just the Emperor. They don't mention he's this Sith guy. And there's really no space battles. There's like one brief escape scene, and that's it. Nor does it have Mandalorian super commandos doing really complex, fight scenes and stunt moves. It is purely focused on espionage and, at most, squad-level fights. between normal soldiers, where, people take losses. It's a very realistic show. It is not trying to sell vehicle toys. That you can tell some other things they're trying to sell vehicles or Legos and things. It wasn't trying to sell merchandise or Baby Yoda stuff. It was trying to tell a really adult political drama. So they weren't trying to cram in unnecessary things, nor was Star Wars put in as an afterthought to some pre-existing show. It's someone wanted to focus on the core story element of how the Galactic Republic turned into the Galactic Empire and the rise of this authoritarian state and the failure of democracy through all of that. That arguably it's the most politically focused, because if you think about the prequel movies, even like Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith, you'd then have Jedi scenes and space battles interspersed in them. That this was concentrated just the political stuff. And it was amazing, and this is the show I would have made, and I don't say that lightly, that I would have made as someone who grew up reading the old Legends books in the 1990s, like the Timothy Zahn Thrawn trilogy, where even though Thrawn is a military commander, a book can't rely on visual spectacle. So a lot of that book was political maneuvering in the New Republic Senate, or Thrawn moving fleets as he would on a chessboard. He has to describe what he's doing, the plotting of that. That any of the expanded universe books where they're actually focused on politics for a change and not just, here's a tie-in comic, that it was focused on plot. That's what I would have done, treating this as seriously as, well, what is the Star Wars galaxy like politically? Who are the power blocks? What are they doing? So that was great. This is the show I would have asked for. I mean, in some form, like I didn't know Andor existed before Rogue One came out, obviously, but this is the type of thing they should have been doing. And like I said, they're not pandering either, because there aren't that many well-known characters in it. Like, there's Cassian Andor, obviously, but he was first introduced in Rogue One. The other major characters that are, legacy characters that are actually in it are Mon Mothma, eventual head of the Rebel Alliance, once again played by Genevieve O'Reilly, who played her in Rogue One, who played her in the prequel trilogy. And she's great, but I've heard some people say, like Red Team Review and Preston Jacobs said, well, Mon Mothma isn't that much of a draw, that she's a household name like Admiral Akbar. Like, Admiral Akbar doesn't cameo in this or anything. And I'm like, she's reasonably well known among Star Wars fans because she was the leader of the Rebel Alliance. If you grew up in the 90s reading the expanded universe stuff, so much of the political books were her as the new chancellor eventually. And we know eventually after the fall of the Empire, Battle of Jakku and stuff, in the new canon, they say she was also the chancellor eventually. We'll see what happens with that. But no, I think Mon Mothma was a nice middle ground between, it's not fan service, but it is enough to draw in people who take the story seriously. Like, Bail Organa doesn't cameo in it. He could have, he simply doesn't. They were very restrained. That when they said, oh, we're going to make an Andor show, you thought, oh, what, it's going to be a rebel cell, just, like doing stuff like in the comics. That isn't what they were doing. That then, when they introduced, no, Mon Mothma's going to be in it, we're going to be seeing the decline of the Imperial Senate, which is already this do-nothing symbol, that there's going to be a lot of politics in that. Once I saw the trailer, wait, Mon Mothma's in this, changed my perception of the show, and it delivered, is my point. I was not disappointed. The trailers fulfilled their promise of one of the other major story strands is Mon Mothma doing that, and they intersect at various points. I think I said there were two other relatively famous characters. The other one was Saw Gerrera, played by Forrest Whitaker, who, again, introduced in Rogue One, just like Andor, though he's appeared in a couple of other cartoons voicing himself and things, and he's a big actor, but that wasn't fan service. He's only in 2 scenes, but they're really big acting and plot scenes, that they're big, important scenes that are addressing the plot, that he's talking about, oh, these are all the other rebel factions we don't get along with. Both scenes are actually in the same location, in Saw's hideout, And they were both dialogue scenes between him and Stellan Skarsgård, so I think they probably filmed all that as one thing and then just chronologically split them. But no, he deserves guest actor awards for that. It wasn't a fan service cameo. It made sense for the plot to have him talking to Saw Gerrera at one point because of the politics of the early rebellion. So that wasn't fan service. That served a purpose, and I'm happy that Forrest Whitaker is... He's nice. He's a big actor. He could be doing other things. Like, he comes to voice this character for, like, Star Wars Rebels, the cartoon. Because, well, it's my character, and I'm in Star Wars. So that's nice for him. But getting back to things, the big thing was Mon Mothma, and that leads into point 2 out of 7 I have. Which is, I've heard this comparison, that it's kind of like the classic TV show The Wire, on many levels, both in terms of it's critical of the system, but in this case, how The Wire would show different scales and aspects of a conflict by switching between different POVs and perspectives on the different scales of it. That, well, you think, like, how does Mon Mothma link to Andor? Well, he is the ground level guy, and she is the top-level person dealing with the macro-scale problems of trying to start this nascent rebellion at the very top. And then there's the mid-level guy, Stellan Skarsgård's new character, Luthen Rael. Luthen is this mid-level, he's the guy who organizes multiple rebel cells. And he's a spy master coordinating these different actions. So he's the guy that sends and recruits Andor for a mission, then he'll go and tell Mon Mothma about it, and you'll see her reacting to, in the Imperial Senate, the Emperor's just pushed through a new legislative package that says we can arrest people without trial or something. And then you see the ripple effect of that on the local level, that Andor gets caught up in a police sweep because of that, and they're arbitrarily extending prison sentences. So it's like The Wire. You have one person in the mayor's office seeing how they're changing the laws, and then you see, like, the street dealers and the police and how the ripple effect of how that's playing out at the ground level. And the link is the mid-level spy master, Luthen, who's coordinating all the rebel groups. So it actually fits together really well. They don't feel like they're separate shows, even though they take place on entirely different worlds. And Cassian never meets Mon Mothma. She never leaves Coruscant. He never goes there. But Luthen is going back and forth, and it links pretty well. It doesn't feel disjointed. That you get a good sense of how the different pieces, that it's a hierarchy of the top-level guys and then the street-level guys, how this is playing out. So, he's going on missions, shooting things. She's dealing with the macro-scale stuff of how do we move millions of credits around in the banks when this authoritarian regime is checking the banks, that there are spies everywhere. Her valet is a spy. And Cassian's just, trying to scrape by a few thousand credits at a time. She has, she's rich. She's from a major family, one of the ruling families of her planet, Chandrilla, which is one of the core worlds. They froze all my assets. How am I going to move 500,000 credits to, put it in a charity fund, which is really siphoning money to the rebellion? How do we deal with that? And some people might think that's boring. I actually think that it worked pretty well, also because it doesn't dwell on that too much. That you see her in the Senate, and then there's a major, well-done subplot where she's has to develop an alliance with a shady banker who can actually hide her money. But that feels relevant. It's a question you didn't know you needed. Like, how do the rebels even move their money around to buy ships and supplies and things? Is one of the realistic questions that comes up. Not, hey, can the Force teleport things? Like, no, I want to hear the story of this galactic rebellion. So that's interesting. It's just someone who enjoys reading a book and not just, hey, laser swords, which are also fun, but they're different. So that's point 2, that it happens on different scales to get a sense of the full conflict. And I really like that. I love it when stories do that you're seeing. It's not just focused on one character, though a lot of it is about Cassian Andor and about Mon Mothma and everything. I'm more of a world-building guy. I just love how it's seeing how this conflict is playing out at multiple scales. Next, we get to one of the really big points in my review, point 3 of 7, and I said some of these have subpoints. Point 3 is the nascent rebellion movement is presented as an actual insurgency, like a historical insurgency paralleling how real-life insurgencies work in terms of their tactics and politics. And I've split this into 3 subpoints that tactically they don't have space battles, their focus on intelligence work and spying, and that there's their politics, that there's actually more than one group of rebels. All this comes into play. So, point 3A here, just I love that they resisted the urge to have space battles, or even like a speeder bike chase. Like, let's randomly throw in a speeder bike chase. Once or twice there's a chase scene, but it makes sense in context. It's not to sell a speeder bike. We're fleeing to get to our ship to get off the planet. It's never the focus. Like, once Luthen has to fire countermeasures at an Imperial ship that caught him in a tractor beam, I would have removed that just because to be able to claim we didn't have a single space scene in it would have been cool. But it's not just that they don't have space battles. That's not my point. Is that they function like an insurgency that isn't trying to fight pitched battles to control territory. Well, pitched battles, it's a space battle, but they don't have fleet-level engagements with capital ships. They don't even really have fighter raids with starfighters. The thing is that they're not trying to capture and hold territory. That isn't how rebellions work. That most of the focus of the early rebellion's activities are on espionage, and occasionally they will make a raid specifically for the pragmatic purpose of we're trying to gather supplies and money. That always bothered me as someone who watched all the movies, that to the casual audience, the impression you get from the original trilogy is that there's all these full-scale fleet battles and fighting Imperial walkers. The movies skew to those because they're cool, but they're the exception and not the rule. And even then, like, the Death Star is a raid with, fighter jets and stuff, but it's not a fleet battle. Okay, you can argue that by the very end, Andor, they have a fleet, but they don't think they're going up against the Imperial fleet. That was a surprise, but even Hoth, they aren't trying to hold the ice planet Hoth. As soon as they see the Imperial fleet, they go, we are evacuating, we're just holding a defensive perimeter to get our ships out. That it isn't a stand-up fight. So I never liked it that they called it the Galactic Civil War. Because if anything, isn't the Separatist crisis more of a civil war where there's two sides, two geopolitical states taking and holding territory, versus the insurgency of the rebellion? I know the Clone Wars were developed after the original trilogy, but semantics-wise, Now, I realize many rebellions are civil wars, but not all civil wars are from the point of the government, I guess. But the point is, it is much more of an insurgency, and it isn't glamorous. That I liked the expanded universe books that did stress that most of the day-to-day work of the rebellion was raiding Imperial convoys and minor bases to gather supplies, and more importantly, and they spell this out in like the spin-off books and stuff, simply to prove that the Empire isn't invincible. That the actual losses they're taking are a drop in the bucket. It's nice if we get supplies, but we're just harassing their military shipping and their convoys if they can't control them with fighter jets, then run as soon as reinforcements arrive. It's not glamorous. You're not blowing up entire fleets. You're not taking and controlling systems. And so many video games, you eventually have like a X-Wing that's blowing up Star Destroyers eventually, or just taking on entire wings of enemy fighters. It doesn't happen like that. That in some people's minds, it turned into Rogue Squadron doing long-distance raids on Imperial convoys turned into Rogue Squadron blowing up an entire fleet of 10 Star Destroyers and hundreds of TIE Fighters based on video games. And this is real. Realistically, this isn't like something out of Iron Eagle or Faster Than the Speed of Love, where we're going to have this rogue team of fighter jet pilots operating out of the desert and on the move like the A-Team, raiding things with their planes. That isn't real. We have this renegade team of fighter pilots single-handedly toppling a large-scale industrialized navy. That's crazy. Thinking on it, you could argue that in the Star Wars universe, starships aren't so much fighter jets as they're like trucks or ships, like freighter ships, if you think about it. So the smaller ones, this is like their version of an interplanetary truck, they're space truckers. I think you could argue that that's the equivalent of having a technical. A technical is, if you see like a footage from Somalia, Afghanistan and stuff, technicals are what they call those flatbed jeeps where they've mounted a heavy caliber machine gun on the back, so to make it a light fighting vehicle. That I could see you argue that like many rebel groups have technicals, have gun trucks like that. You could argue that raiding Imperial convoys with X-Wings is like militiamen raiding something with gun-mounted jeeps or something, but the analogy was like World War II dogfighting, it takes away from that. But the point is, they're not doing that at all, nor do they don't even show when they are raiding things. That there is a big raid that one faction does on a power plant, not Andor's faction, a different faction, and it happens entirely off-screen. You just hear radio reports about it in an Imperial meeting at the end of the season. The restraint they showed that Luthen does have a tricked out spy ship with all these countermeasures, but it's not on this hotshot fighter jock. Like, I think you see a parked X-Wing at one point, or maybe it was a Z-95 Headhunter at Saw Gerrera's camp, that they do have a few ships, but you never see starfighters going at each other. Like, you see TIE fighters on patrol, but that's nothing. They're going against ground targets. That real insurgencies aren't generally people who have vehicles, barring the odd Jeep or something, and they're not trying to take and hold territory. They are in insurgency. I'm thinking on the scale of, well, Lucas was heavily influenced by Vietnam, for example. Like, the Viet Cong didn't have an air force and didn't have really tanks. Granted, the North Vietnamese did. The Viet Minh were the regular North Vietnamese army. That's entirely separate. Did have fighter combat over that, but the insurgency part of the Vietnam War, which is really the core of it, you're fighting partisans in the jungle, and they're raiding your positions. This isn't that you're taking and holding territory. I remember how, I think it was that movie Born on the 4th of July, the real guy behind that or something, it was Vietnam veterans who remarked they felt betrayed by, early on in Vietnam, John Wayne made a propaganda movie, essentially, called The Ballad of the Green Berets, which presented Vietnam like a conventional war. And it was almost like they transported a Western to Vietnam, where there's a distinct enemy base that has tanks, and they're fighting to control territory, and we have to attack them. These are raiders who melt away into the jungle, who aren't trying to make a stand-up fight, that it didn't present it as the guerrilla warfare that troops actually saw when they went to Vietnam, of they just have us patrolling around and reacting to things and going through villages and fruitlessly asking if there's Viet Cong around, and then they attack in the night. That is what guerrilla warfare is like. And we never really saw guerrilla warfare in that style in Star Wars before, presented that way. And even then, most of it happens off screen, that, like Saw Gerrera mentions, we're going to raid something. And even then, they're using ships, that it's hit and run. Which brings me what I've been trying to build up to here. Have you ever heard of something called the Foco theory of revolution? It was articulated by Che Guevara, actually, the famous Cuban revolutionary, of his thoughts on, well, how do you fight an insurgency to lead to a revolution? And I'll put a link to this to the Wikipedia page. That's what I'm building up to. That Andor was a really good example of the Foco theory of revolution, which is a realistic take on this that I'm surprised they showed. The theory is explicitly, you are not trying to militarily take and hold major cities, take and hold territory. That you are guerrilla fighters out in the rural areas, out in the jungles, out in the desert. You're hiding. You aren't trying to take and hold territory. You're trying to humiliate the government to show that they're not invincible. And eventually, this is the key point, to spark off a large-scale mass uprising by the general populace. That you are not trying to take territory, you aren't trying to even gradually build up the number of rockets you have for an eventual, at some later point, push into the cities. You are trying to humiliate the government to lead to a mass uprising. Like, you can't, if there's mass riots in all of your major cities, or even some of your military units start mutinying and joining them, you can't fight that if everyone rises up at the same time. And that's what they all go for, that they're just trying to humiliate the occupying power. The 1968 Tet Offensive, for example, I keep going to Vietnam because, it inspired the Ewoks. It's just the whole, we're fighting in the jungle, taking on we're technologically superior, and they're guerrilla fighters who know the land better and who aren't trying to, fight that way. That Vietnam, 1968 Tet Offensive, was an all-out attack by the Viet Cong guerrillas, the guerrilla group in the South, on every major American and South Vietnamese city or position at the same time, simultaneously across the entire country. And they spread their forces too thin. From a military standpoint, the Viet Cong lost the Tet Offensive. Not only that, they suffered such devastating losses that since the Tet Offensive in 1968, for the rest of the war, the Viet Cong functionally ceased to exist as a viable military organization capable of coordinated responses, much less new offensive. That they never recovered. From the rest of the war, it was fighting the conventional North Vietnamese military, the Viet Minh. That was separate, but the guerrilla warfare, they used up all of their forces. The problem was that the Tet Offensive inflicted such heavy casualties on the U.S. and ARVN forces that it shattered the perception that the U.S. was invincible and demoralized everyone else. So then again, it did fail to spark a general uprising, but the point is it humiliated them. And the idiot general in charge, Westmoreland, he said, well, we're measuring victory by the number of enemy body bags. No, insurgencies do not work like that. By definition, they have a bottomless well of people from the general population who can fill their ranks again. The whole point is to make sure they're not invincible. Same thing happened in the Irish War of Independence, that they spread their forces thin in this all-out attack, Michael Collins and everything, but it gave the perception that they're attacking everywhere at once. We're not invincible, we can't hold it, so it pushed the British to the negotiation table, even though the IRA had exhausted themselves. The American War of Independence, Battle of Bunker Hill, lost the battle, but the losses they inflicted were so heavy that it gave the perception of, we aren't winning here. That there's a lot of parallels. Afghanistan, a lot of other things. France, Algiers, the Battle of Algiers, that movie covering that conflict. Great thing where they bring in this counterinsurgency agent, and he explains, don't punish the general population. That plays into the rebels' hands. Any self-respecting rebel group has already worked out your ID system, so don't bother with checkpoints. It'll only frustrate the general population. What are we going to do here? Also makes me think of Red Dawn. 1984's A Red Dawn, where they bring in this counterinsurgency expert from the Russian army who is yelling at the local garrison that there's American rebels up in the mountains of Colorado, and they were, every time they attacked, the Russians and their Latin American allies would make, the Cubans would make these reprisals against the civilian population. If every time they attack, we'll round up a dozen or two civilians and have them publicly executed. That this Russian Special Forces commando comes in and has this whole board meeting scene where he yells at them, from this moment on, and he's this really tough guy, but he goes, from this moment on, there will be no more civilian reprisals. That was stupidity and impotence, because it doesn't work. They are trying to make you do that to make the public turn on you, and it's gaining them allies. We wanted the people pacified. So Speechy goes where, if a fox sneaks into your chicken coop, would you kill your pig because he saw the fox? No. You would hunt down the fox. You would find where it lives and destroy it. Simply punishing the general population doesn't work. Which leads to that this is specifically what Luthen was trying to do. This is how real insurgencies work. They are trying to provoke the government into making a crackdown that will turn the general public increasingly against them. It's a two-pronged thing. You're trying to show they're not invincible by humiliating them, and piss them off so much that they oppress the main population enough that it'll spark a general uprising, because they're both being mistreated and realize those heroic rebels in the hills are showing they're not invincible. That whole thing where Luthen explains word for word to Mon Mothma, yes, the entire point of they go on this raid to steal the quarter. One of the story arcs they do is they go on a raid to steal the quarterly payroll from for an entire Imperial sector before it gets distributed. And Luthen explains that's like a secondary goal, that it's nice to have money, like where does the rebellion get its money from? But Mon Mothma has money. She has money from the core worlds, and she has to move it through the banks. That his primary goal was to trick the Empire into instigating a crackdown. So then you have the intelligence agency with Colonel Yularen there, and he's a major character in the expanded universe, and listing off this big scene of, we're going to crack down on everyone, we're going to increase prison sentences, we are going to restrict movement on things, levy taxes and punish everyone. And the one relatively smart, relatively competent ISB agent, Imperial Security Bureau, Dedra Miro, she's one of the other POVs, she remarks in this big plot-heavy scene of, we are playing into the rebels' hands. This is exactly what they wanted. They wanted a crackdown. They are trying to provoke us into antagonizing the general population enough that their suffering will breed further insurgency. It's this big point that Luthen makes, that the Empire has been gradually increasing its grip on the galaxy to the point that people aren't provoked enough. If you do it stepwise, he's trying to make them clench their fist too fast to piss people off. This is how insurgencies work. And it was brilliant writing. Because it's not glamorous. And you almost get the sense that, because the team that they send on the Aldani mission to do this raid on the Imperial payroll, there's such a bunch of misfits, you actually wonder if he thought it would succeed. And it's like he hoped it would succeed, and you do see him worrying about it, but a failed attempt to steal a payroll would have had a similar effect. The fact that they succeeded made the Empire even more mad. But it was just to show them, you're not invincible, we're attacking you. It makes me think of all the counterinsurgency stuff, how also like Darth Vader is one of the few smart, genre-savvy guys in the Empire. I always love that he can tell when what the good guys are going to do, because he was himself once a good guy. So he knows they'll make a rescue, let them, leave a tracker on them, it'll lead us back to their base. He's smart enough to know what they're going to do. I remember, like in A New Hope, when he takes Leia's ship, and one of his lieutenants says, if word gets out about this, it'll generate sympathy in the Imperial Senate. He doesn't, like Tarkin, start pompously going, who cares? he takes that warning seriously. He goes, no, we'll blame it on pirates. We'll hush it up. We'll kill everyone but Leia. That he knows, don't let word get out that you're doing this stuff. Or, Jeddah was not destroyed. It was a mining accident. Remember that? That was classic Darth Vader. He's smart enough to know you're not supposed to do that. That Darth Vader was not really on board with the Death Star project. Don't be so proud of this technological terror. I mean, he's defending it because it's an Imperial project, but he disagreed with it because he didn't think it would work. I mean, yeah, the Emperor gave his go-ahead, but the whole Tarkin doctrine is we're going to rule through fear. That we're going to blow up a few planets and it'll make the others get shocked into submission. Maybe if everyone was under threat of that constantly, but it's like a nuke. You can't nuke everywhere all at once. It's not like you could nuke all of Vietnam or Iraq. That insurgency, you'd have to blow up the very thing you're trying to control. And it's not that different from like a planetary bombardment by the Imperial fleet. It'll take half the Imperial fleet to do that. They could. It's a matter of scale that I'm thinking ahead for Tarkin. Another thing they mentioned in Andor was the Gorman system and the Gorman front. They mention it more than once. Mon Mothma is briefly seen yelling about that we've blockaded the Gorman system because they're protesting the Empire. And we know that timeline-wise, I think 3 years from now, so in a later season of Andor, is this major event called the Gorman Massacre, where Tarkin massacred this system that was protesting people. It's the equivalent of if you had the White House Mall or something bigger than that, or Trafalgar Square or something. It was this giant protest against the Empire with like 1 million people in a public square, and he landed a Star Destroyer on them. Or something like that. I think canon might have changed that, but that he massacred a genocide-level statistic like 1 million people to show we are the Empire, we will rule through fear. That it generated mass sympathy throughout the galaxy. It was like a mini earlier version of Alderaan. The Gorman Massacre was the spark that made the formal Rebel Alliance start. That was when Mon Mothma gave a public speech that I'm leading this thing called the Alliance to Restore the Republic. We have this formal government in exile, which doesn't really do anything, but it's a symbol. That's when she stopped playing senator and all the local rebel cells coalesced into this opposition government as a united front. Barring the one or two holdouts like Saw Gerrera, who eventually killed off. But the Gorman Massacre is a big thing that's going to happen in a later season, and it will show the point that Tarkin's whole thing of we rule through fear. If they protest, we have a big public crackdown. You never do that. You win the hearts and minds. And then, well, if that's a popular saying, why didn't it work in Vietnam? They really never lived up to that goal of win the hearts and minds. They weren't really trying to. People were yelling, you need to win the hearts and minds, doesn't mean they really did a good job of it. In things I've seen in like Afghanistan stuff, where when the post-action reports of why did this fail, we were never able to overcome the systemic corruption of the local government and warlords who were all the money we were sending to build schools and vaccines and roads. They were just siphoning off all of that. And the local governors wouldn't report on it because they didn't want to look bad. There's another major point, I'm just repeating this, that people would pad their reports rather than admit things aren't going well. That we're, like Vietnam, Afghanistan, they'd say, we're like a year away from pacifying this, rather than admit this is an open-ended problem that we need more resources for. So that's another point I'm going to get back to, but that the goal of an insurgency is to simultaneously humiliate the public, the major government, and force their hand to make a crackdown, because this will anger the public into making a mass uprising, because they also see that the main government isn't invincible. This is the story. We have never really seen a Star Wars project emphasize this much. It's an insurgency. We're trying to use the Foco theory and humiliate them. We're not trying to take and hold territory. That was amazing. Okay, don't yell at me for this, but I actually think The Rise of Skywalker showed this idea relatively well, but as one of the couple of good things in the movie, that it's a holdover. It's an idea George Lucas had himself. That this came up in Star Wars Rebels, the cartoon. That there's one episode where it's just a group of kids who stole a freighter, who are taking pot shots at Imperial convoys because it's a nowhere system, that there's barely TIE fighters there. And they keep hearing, and the group we're following keeps hearing, oh, there's a rebel cell there, and it's just a couple of kids with cars taking pot shots at convoys. But the fact that it's inspiring people everywhere to make their own rebellion wherever they are. And talking in the inside the episode thing for that, Pablo Hidalgo explained that this is a really big idea George Lucas had in the outlines for the 70s stuff, that eventually normal people, not rebels, just normal people everywhere will rise up against tyranny. Just anywhere that oppression does that, because it's like that thing from Captain America, from the comics that they then did in the movie, where he's the lone man walking out to fight Thanos. That as long as there is one righteous man, there is hope, because it will inspire others. That this one rebel group, that as long as there's one man walking out to fight them, it will inspire others to rise. And it's beautiful. But that idea that it will inspire others to fight, and this general uprising, well, that was already a thing in Star Wars Rebels years ago, and I remembered that when I saw Rise of Skywalker, the idea that the Resistance is smashed, they're losing, and then this giant fleet shows up, and they go, it's not an alliance of all the local planetary fleets, of military fleets even, though there are some of those. They go, it's just people. It's anyone who had a ship with some guns mounted for pirates or whatever. It's just if every single ship in the entire galaxy came to one planet, that it's just this mass uprising. They go, it's just people. It isn't even an organized fleet. They just heard the call and they came. That is the purpose of a resistance movement, is sparking a general uprising like that. That's one of the things Rise of Skywalker got right, while cutting out their original plans to do Coruscant stuff, or they didn't set up the granddaughter thing they should have said. That there were other problems, but that was one of the things they got right. That it's supposed to spark a general uprising, which is a theme that Lucas had already been working on for other stuff, and just his feelings on the Empire and the system in general. That it isn't about taking and holding planets. This isn't the Clone Wars. Point 3b on that they function like a real insurgency. This is shorter. That there is a big focus, realistic focus, on intelligence and counterintelligence, which is one of the biggest parts of any insurgency. That the wet work of dealing with spies, more than hacking things, which hacking becomes magic. We barely see the mainstay Imperial Army or Navy in this. That the Imperial side of things is mostly with their intelligence agency, the Imperial Security Bureau, which is like their CIA, or in this case Gestapo. That they're not the secret police as such, they're the intelligence branch. That they're not Army, they're not Navy. And on the rebel side of things, we see the setup phases, that the slow steps needed to set up the execution of the Aldhani payroll heist. That they don't just go in guns blazing and make it up as they go along like Indiana Jones, an indie ploy, as they say. That you see there's this focus on reconnaissance and infiltration, slowly planning out what they're going to. They say, we've been doing this for months. And then they execute it. And compartmentalization of information, that a key point is Luthen doesn't tell the different cells he's talking to about the other cells, so if they get captured, they can't really reveal that much. That is a major point of major resistances and insurgencies. One of the basic rules, compartmentalization of information. And that's why the ISB wants to get Luthen so bad. They nickname him, they say, we codenamed him Axis. We don't know who he is, but we've been able to figure out there's one guy coordinating all these rebel cells. And sort of the plot is Cassian is the only person who they can name who has seen Luthen face to face. They say, we don't know who Axis is. The only lead we have is that he met some low-level guy called Cassian Andor to recruit him. They just happened to catch him. They escape. But they want to capture Cassian so they can interrogate him to find out who he's working for. And if they can find Luthen, they can take out all these other cells. Again, the whole, if the fox is in your chicken coop, you don't kill the pig, you hunt the fox. That not just punishing civilians, picking off the low-level guys doesn't achieve anything. Like the Vietnam commander going, we're measuring victory in body bags. No, they have an infinite well of people. Or Afghanistan, that they could always reconstitute their numbers because they're an insurgency. They don't need to be well armed. That what you're supposed to do with counterinsurgency is win the hearts and minds by supporting a legitimate, not corrupt government, and then using your intelligence agency to painstakingly, slowly develop a full list of the rebel group that you're hunting, find the very top of their command structure, and wipe it out. Like Zero Dark 30 style, taking down Osama bin Laden, that if you're just picking off the street-level guys... Once again, this reminds me of The Wire, where they're talking about the drug war and everything, that a big complaint they have is, we're picking off the street-level guys and the dealers, but we are not even touching the gang leaders, or the businesses that are backing them. Or like in a mafia movie, that you've got the trigger men, but you never get the capos or the leadership, that nothing changes because we're just getting the foot soldiers. And that's a major problem they have. But just the emphasis on, and I've seen articles on this of like spies saying Andor showed this really well, that there's a point where Luthen tells him, don't carry a commercial communicator if you don't control it. He has a custom one that's encoded, that the first thing he does is he smashes his phone because they were tracking it. That make sure who you can trust. Double agents are a big thing, that the rebels have a mole at the ISB, and just the little things of the wet work of making sure you know who to trust, who you can track, trying to use compartmentalization information. And the mole thing reminded me of the whole thing with Churchill and the Enigma code. With they didn't want to tip their hand that they had cracked the Nazi communication codes like Enigma. So they had to let the Nazis attack a city in England, because otherwise they would try to scramble their defenses for Normandy or something, that they didn't want to tip their hand for the bigger project that we actually do know your codes. That there's a big plot point later that when they go, the mole told us they figured out that the off-screen raid I mentioned, they know that off-screen raid is going to happen, but the mole is worth the lives of 30 men from that failed mission. So we're just going to let it go through to preserve our intelligence assets. I think that's a quote by Sun Tzu, actually, that like, what is the quote? That like one spy is worth 100 soldiers? I forget the exact quote. That no, intelligence is the most important part of any conflict. Preserving that. So intelligence-wise, I'm thinking like Battle of Algiers stuff, like in that old movie, that the focus on intelligence, counterintelligence, double agents, all of that. So of point 3 here, which had 3 points, it's like a real insurgency. They're doing Che Guevara's Foco theory of they're trying to spark off an uprising. 2, real intelligence work. And 3, this is the third subpoint of point 3, like many real-life insurgencies against various regimes, there's actually more than one group of rebels, and they're not politically united at this early point. I mean, just look at like a map of the Syrian civil war. These are entirely different factions. It is not a two-way conflict. There's like, at the height of it, a dozen different varying factions competing with each other in a multi-sided environment. And they were already establishing this a bit since Rogue One, that they said, well, there's the Rebel Alliance, then there's Saw Gerrera's partisans are the ultra-violent fringe radical extremists of the rebel cells who the Alliance to Restore the Republic, led by Mon Mothma, the Alliance and the partisans don't get along, and they reject him because he's willing to attack civilians and have collateral damage that they won't. This came up a bit in the Star Wars Rebels cartoon when Saw Gerrera showed up, and you see Mon Mothma and Bail Organa disavowing him. And just eventually he moves to Jeddah, his forces get weathered down, and eventually he dies. So, like, after battling Yavin and stuff, it was just the Rebel Alliance. But I think they did a good job of showing in the early days there was more than one thing. Like, even in the old Legends continuity, the general explanation they gave was, since day one, since the Empire started, there were always pop-up rebellions somewhere, just bubbling up all over the galaxy, local stuff, and they gradually coalesced into bigger organizations, and much of this was due to the work of Bail Organa and Mon Mothma, and senators who were still loyal to the Republic organizing them. And it turned into, there came a point where this happened in Rebels, they go, we are officially this government in exile, the Alliance to Restore the Republic. That hasn't happened yet. And now they're giving names to these different organizations. It's not just the partisans who they never managed to get in. There's this giant scene, giant for me, very intriguing, I've seen major channels reporting on it, where Luthen is meeting with Saw Gerrera and asking, I'm trying to organize a raid. This has nothing to do with Andor. He says, I'm trying to organize a raid on a power station. There's this other rebel cell leader. We want to know if you can help. We'll split the rewards with you. And he goes, I'm not going to work with him. He's a separatist. That makes sense that there are still separatist holdouts from the Clone Wars. They lost the droid armies, but they never stopped fighting. We already saw that in other spin-offs, just local level militias and stuff from the separatists. We're seeing this in the Bad Batch and everything in that cartoon, that there's separatist holdouts, and then there's also people who were on the Republic side who turned on them, like you see in Bad Batch Season 1, Saw Gerrera starting the partisans. But up till this point, I thought it was just those three, that there's the separatist holdouts, there's the pro-Republic people that are Mon Mothma's people that are generally, as soon as they discover each other, start working together. And then there's the ultra-violent fringe of the Saw Gerrera's partisans. There's this paragraph speech that Whitaker delivers very well as Saw Gerrera, where he lists off that, no, there's like a dozen different rebel movements with different political ideologies at this point. That he lists off, well, there's the separatists, Maya Pei is a neo-Republican. That's very interesting. What is neo-Republican? Sounds like someone who'd be on Mon Mothma's side. And they mention Maya Pei again. Maybe she'll come up in Season 2. Never heard of her before. She's a new character. But he mentions that there's separatists, neo-Republicans, human cultists, sectorists, galactic partitionists, and the Partisan Alliance. And what's confusing about that is Saw Gerrera's, and other people have already remarked on this, Saw Gerrera's group are the partisans, but he speaks about the Partisan Alliance as if there's something separate from that. So what, is he the partisan front, a distinct thing that's split off from the Partisan Alliance? So it's just, oh, screw that. We're not the Judean People's Front, we're the People's Front of Judea, with the partisans. As more than one person has already brought up, but it's funny because it's real. That's what happens in opposition movements or rebel movements. When you have one group in power, you have the other group competing with each other over internal factional differences leading to logjams, and they're fighting each other more than they are the main group. You damn splitters. But it makes sense also that there would be like, what internal divisions are there in the galaxy? Well, there's supposed to be anti-alien sentiment because the core worlds are mostly human, so there's human supremacists or regional powers who they're not separatists, but they're like anarchists. They want Fondor is for Fondor. We want to just be a local independence thing. Screw everyone else. The partitionists, it was this fascinating scene. You can find it on YouTube. Again, it wasn't just a small cameo. He gave a really good performance in these two really good plot-heavy scenes. And this was one of those world-building scenes that really expands the world, where in a paragraph he mentioned, no, there's like half a dozen to a dozen different rebel movements of different political ideologies, or just personal rivalries, the partisan alliance. We're the partisan front. But that is true. You see that in so many rebel movements throughout history, that there's, or even in politics, when it's not coming to violence, it just, I mean, obviously the People's Front of Judea was making fun of how the liberal side of British politics was divided into many sub-factions and wouldn't unite against the common enemy of Thatcher, the Campaign for a Free Galilee. So I could go on, but all three of those points of point three, that they function like a real insurgency in terms of their tactics, in terms of their intelligence work, and in terms of that they realistically have divided politics. Moving on from that, point four. It shows the Empire as an actual authoritarian regime, the way that Lucas wanted. Yes, with the erosion and decline of democracy, but that's the overt stuff and almost childish, and that's the basic stuff. That's the enemy you can see when there's soldiers goose-stepping down your street, the erosion and decline of democracy. But the real thing that makes authoritarian regimes scary is when they're subtle. The slow creep of it. That for Lucas, it wasn't just authoritarianism. Like, obviously, visually, they copied a lot of stuff from the Nazis and fascism for the Empire, but he said a lot of it was, the corruption of the Nixon presidency in Vietnam and just the American empire, imperialism, and the military-industrial complex, which is also a corporate thing. So, on a broader level, and Lucas has said this publicly, the Empire is the system. Capital S, the system. And if you look at his work, it's like his first film, THX 1138, where it's, people who are living under this authoritarian regime of robot police. They're known by a number, a serial number, dehumanizing them. And their lives are very regulated, and they take drugs to suppress their emotions. That the Empire is the system. It's the man, stick it to the man, it's the man. That it's not even about the overt things like bloody massacres. That's the easy enemy to fight, but increased surveillance and curtailing civil liberties, watering down the civilian government until it's powerless. And they're not trying to kill you, they need you as a labor force, just they're watering down your rights, liberties, and your say in government. So what was really great in Andor was it wasn't just, and here's the Empire brutally massacring people, visually ripping off like Holocaust imagery or something. It's the small ways the Empire is incrementally taking over. That it's getting gradually more restrictive. And it's not this giant leap. Even when they do their crackdown, it isn't this giant leap of we're bringing back slavery for non-humans, as they are doing that in the Outer Rim. It's just, we're drastically increasing prison sentences for the sake of security. We're freeing our hands up for a bit more of surveillance. That it isn't something on the scale of we built a Death Star. Or even we're outlawing the Imperial Senate. That was that even since the first film, Lucas showed that the process that the Republic turning into the Empire was a process. Because Palpatine wasn't stupid enough to try to do it all at once. Fascist regimes rarely are. The successful ones aren't that stupid. I mean, even look at the rise of the Nazis in Germany. It was an incremental process. Like, he got elected to chancellorship in 1933, and then the Reichstag ploy, and then there was a point where they passed a new package of laws, and I think it was 34, that gradually taking away the rights and transferring it to the military and stuff, that there were phases it went through. They didn't do it like the turn of a switch. It happened in the space of only a few years, but incrementally enough that people won't immediately react. And it varies from one thing to the next, but you see this all over the place, that the successful ones, it's not really an overt revolution like that. That's Hollywood. When it's subtle, it's a process. So even the first movie showed that 20 years since the Empire came around, or almost 20 years, the last vestiges of the Imperial Senate have been swept away, and even then, some of the military guys are uneasy with it, that the Imperial Senate has no real power anymore. But he goes like, how will we maintain the pretense of control over the local systems without the bureaucracy? Well, we'll put military governors in control, and it'll be fear of the Death Star. That the Imperial Senate didn't have power, but it was a symbol that they were maintaining the pretense of an Imperial Senate, much as the real Roman Empire kept the Senate around even for hundreds of years, even after the Emperor was the real only power, as a social club. So just that point 4 is the Empire as an actual authoritarian regime where it's not about super weapons, spaceships, Death Stars, or soldiers and troops marching around. It's the system. And the system spreads subtly and incrementally, gradually becoming more restrictive until people are just cogs in a machine. And that is a big thing, that there's points where they almost hit you over the head with it, but you kind of need to because people don't pay attention. That big speech that the base commander in Aldani gives, where he says, the key to controlling the locals, we found, is to give them fake alternatives so they have the illusion of choice and control. This stick and carrot routine. And they do mention this in the thing, that they go, hey, you don't like it, complain to your imperial senator. That they have the illusion that they still have a senate when they really don't. Or like the first episode, they actually go, hey, if the rent-a-cops who are working for them, the first set of people he fights aren't even the Empire directly, but these corporate rent-a-cops working for them. That when they're about to try to arrest him at the end of the third episode, the end of the first story arc, when they're getting ready to go, the rent-a-cops go, hey, and if they don't like it, they can always complain to the local sector's monthly forum. And they all laugh that, well, there's the complaint box over there, that some people will want to believe that they still have a say or that their complaints will mean something. Or I'm going to make an online petition to have that changed, that it rarely ever works. That you have the illusion that you're still in control. That the message they're sending is that if you stay in your lane, keep your head down, if you just act like the cog in the machine, things will work out, you'll be safe, you'll have the same standard of living as your parents did, as long as you're not actively rebelling. Keep working in the system on Ferrix, the planet he's on, or the other things we see on Coruscant, or with Cyril Karn, the Rent-a-Cop. Work within the system, and you'll eventually earn a proportionate reward. And all of this just comes to the fore and in hyper-focus in the prison arc. At a certain point he gets caught in a random prison sweep and gets sent to a prison, which is treating people like machines, that you are a cog in a machine. But this has always been a theme in Star Wars. Like, the symbol of the Empire is a cog. And when they're in the prison, the whole show is like this. You see this happening in society with the gradual restrictions. The prison is just the end goal. But you realize that society outside of the prison is becoming more and more like that. The prison industrial complex. But it's just ahead of the curve, the prison arc. That he says, I like that they do point out, like, why do we use manual labor in the future? They explicitly say, well, droids are expensive. We're cheaper than droids and easier to replace than if they used automation. And even today, you go, why do you use, like, prison labor? Automation would be too expensive. And I love that they're not just, like, mining with pickaxes or pushing mining carts. The visuals of that prison assembly line were amazing, that it is specifically an assembly line doing grunt work. It's not about the manual labor of it, even, of, like, where I'm pushing a heavy mining cart. Oh, look, the strain. It's hard work, but there's 6 people to a team, and you are one part of the team. You are one part in the assembly line. You are just part of a machine of people. That you're an asset. Or, like, extension like the clone troopers. are manufactured like droids, the THX-1138 stuff, that you have become a statistic, you're a cog in a machine. I know I keep repeating that, but that's what they're aiming for, strictly regulated, and they're not outright mistreating them if you keep your head down. They're always going to keep working you, but they don't beat anyone randomly, and they feed them a nutrient paste, and one of the other prisoners says you can eat as much as you want because they want us strong and able to keep working, but it's just like a tasteless nutrient paste. And that they actually have, this is a big thematic point, they have the different work teams competing to get the most production quota per day because the winner of the day gets food with flavor in it. And it's the empire in your mind. The system, when it's in your mind, that some of the prisoners actually get so wrapped up in competing with each other over trinkets, bread and circuses, when stand back and realize we are literally being used like assembly robots in a prison, and you're competing for the good work sticker. You know? That how insidious that is when you get wrapped up in that. And this has happened to everyone. I've had bad jobs where I got so wrapped up in the day-to-day project that I didn't stand back and didn't want to admit the system is flawed, I need to look for a better job. Or college courses where eventually I dropped the course because it wasn't what I thought it would be and I switched to something else. But where you're trying that middle point, where you haven't given up on the course yet, you're hoping it'll work out if you just try harder, and this is not what I thought it would be. And some people go, well, oh, this is clearly a criticism of capitalism. Well, not capitalism so much as corporatocracy, and again, the system, military-industrial complex, that they're trying to lead you by the nose, that cheap, meaningless incentives, what's that thing on Severance where they offer them waffles when it's we don't want waffles, that is a fraction of the money that you could be putting towards a real pay raise. That these are trinkets that you're dangling in front of us. Any job you've had, I've had jobs like this, where they go, oh, we have a Bagel Friday. That isn't the stable pay raise that I wanted. And competing over a tiny bonus, I've had friends, this is not me personally, who said, I had a job where we were all at the office where we were competing for the tiny bonus. When I took the job originally, we all thought we'd get incremental annual salary increases. Official pay raises. And here we are, one of us will get a one-time bonus that they're not required to give more than 1 year at a time. And that they complained to me that I got so wrapped up in competing for that bonus, I never stopped to think, I was promised a regular pay increase, and this isn't happening. This system is flawed. You are lying to me. This isn't what I was promised. So that's with other people. I didn't experience that personally. Just the little things of when you're offered fake incentives. And it's not that it's frustrating that they offer it. It's weird how some people really try to embrace that. That the system is broken, but defiantly want to keep believing in it. This, of course, brings us to one of the rent-a-cops that at the beginning works for the corporate police, Cyril Karn. He's one of the main characters. You get the sense that he's going to be a major character in later seasons. You think he's going to be a major character in season 1. He really isn't. Cyril Karn is this corporate rent-a-cop who genuinely believes in what he's doing. He's proud to be, I'm a police officer. You're a security guard. That he even gets his uniform tailored. We are doing this great work here, and his superiors are all lazy. They don't care. But it's weird how he believes in the system, genuinely believes in it, when he is a low-ranking guy. And the thing is that 2 corrupt rent-a-cops tried to mug Andor in the opening scene, and he kills them in self-defense. And even Cyril's superiors are willing to write this off as they were probably trying to mug someone. He accurately guesses they were in the red light district, they shouldn't have been there, got in a stupid fight, got killed, it was their own fault, let's leave it at that. That the unspoken thing is Karn wants to capture Andor for killing those 2 guys because it infuriates him, it rattles him, that security guards shouldn't be expendable. I mean, it's a security. The metaphor would be more obvious if he was like a stormtrooper or something going, you can't let someone just kill 2 stormtroopers. I'm a stormtrooper. As this corporate rent-a-cop that realizing you are an expendable cog in the machine just as much as everyone else. That you are not really advancing in the system, even though you are a low-level guard. Comparisons have been made between this show and Terry Gilliam's Brazil, that it's showing, the system, corporatocracy, that he loses for failing to capture Andor. Cyril loses his job and gets a new one, filling out bureaucratic reports on fuel requisitions in what is visually, for Star Wars, looks like a modern Western office. It's like the cut of the clothes looks like he has a tie, and it looks like office cubicles, and it pulls back like something out of Terry Gilliam's Brazil, and there's just hundreds of office drones. And it's intercutting this with Andor in an actual prison cell, that's showing that the visual metaphor, that's, it's obviously hitting you over the head, but it's for a reason, that you are both prisoners in the system. And that was a big quote that Dedra Miro, the ISB officer, gives at one point, that the rebels are, there's this thing where she says the rebels are functioning like an insurgency. They don't follow the arbitrary sectors we made. They don't care about lines we make on a map. And she figured out that they were stealing stuff between different sectors, never hitting the same sector twice, so no one would notice, until she got access to all of the information and realized, no, this is actually a sustained campaign. It's like the equivalent of jumping state lines in the United States so people wouldn't notice. That's why the FBI now has multi-state jurisdiction, because that's what people were doing. But this big scene where they say, oh, you're against our protocol that didn't allow you to check every system at once, and she snaps back, systems that don't adapt die. That when you have a rigid system that doesn't adapt, and that's kind of the theme of the thing, is Brazil, Terry Gilliam thing, but for a reason. That it's not just the Hollywood trope of we're the Nazis, we're the cartoon bad guy who's attacking the innocent villagers. Those are the easy enemies to fight when there's actual shooting and massacres. The hard thing to fight is just when things are getting more restrictive and you are gradually losing influence. All of this meanders into 0.5 out of 7 for my Andor review, and this is the last of the big points. The rest are just follow-ups. Thinking of that the system, capital S, is insidious and ensnares you in, and you don't even realize you're being controlled, and just how do you escape the system? How do you change this? That a rigid system like that is inherently flawed. And they spell this out. Sometimes you need to spell out these things, like when Dedra Miro says a system that doesn't adapt will die. But the bigger one is in a later episode in the season, Cassian listens to the manifesto written by another rebel that he kept saying, I'm working on this manifesto, and then he listens to it. And the part that he's listening to right there, it's a clip of a longer thing, is this speech he gives about, without the support of the people, the system being imposed on them is inherently so artificial and therefore rigid that it's flawed. Cracks and leaks will show up. That they spell this out, that anything that is that rigid and unthinking can't adapt. Anything that's artificial can't adapt. It's not self-organization from a democratic free society, that if you have to keep people controlled like that all the time, something is going to go wrong. And you won't even accept the possibility of failure, because the system has to believe it's perfect. That this is a whole thing with fascist governments, that they have to believe in their own perfection, which means they always overestimate their own strength and underestimate their enemies. And it's not just authoritarian regimes. I'm thinking of all the stuff George Lucas said about corporatocracy, military-industrial complex. If you've ever just had a bad job at a place where the boss wouldn't accept failure as an option. And the example I'm really thinking of that springs to mind, I mean, it's no accident, is Stellan Skarsgård's other big TV show from a few years ago, Chernobyl. The Chernobyl miniseries. That a big theme in that was the Soviet Union, which was this authoritarian state, believed it was perfect. And in my channel, I've posted clips from that because we were making fun of how this is a Game of Thrones channel, that they thought Game of Thrones Season 8 would be perfect, therefore they didn't anticipate anything could go wrong with it, or behind-the-scenes production follies. That it was the show that aired on HBO right after Game of Thrones, so there's this really great clip by Stellan Skarsgård. It's the video I post on my channel videos, this long series of clips from the making of Season 8, as all of these amateur problems were happening because they didn't bother to think, wait a minute, won't our pipes burst in winter and stuff like that? And I edit in these Stellan Skarsgård clips, and he's a major character in Andor. It's this clip of Skarsgård saying how fascinating the Soviet Union was because it was a society that it believed it was the perfect system, to the point that there was no possibility for error. So when error did happen, they had no idea how to respond. And he pointed out, the Soviets were just one good example. This is any system that thinks it's perfect will have that problem. That you think you created the perfect society or religion or perfect company. Anytime you think you're perfect, you're doomed to failure, eventually. This is a great quote he gave. So, of course, it comes up again here in this show, that if you think you're perfect, there's going to be error. There's a couple of subpoints to this of just the cracks in the system, and that it isn't just blindly, but good will eventually triumph, that there are specific logical reasons that this fake authoritarian regime will fail, because there's just so many internal problems. A general one is the rank and file of the empire are just a new bureaucracy that replaced the old one. The only difference being they're more overtly ruthless about it, while still being just as incompetent. I mean, what's the story of Star Wars? That the Galactic Empire got corrupt and rotten with decay, bureaucrats who were greedy corrupt politicians out for themselves. The Empire came in and swept all that away and promised peace and order, and there wouldn't be infighting anymore. But they replaced them with a new bureaucracy, and up to this point, a lot of the movies and generally the expanded universe never showed the Imperial officers as bumbling and corrupt. Like, sometimes they'd show them as overconfident or punch clock villains, that I'm just doing a civil service job. Hey, I'm a garrison commander, I don't really care about any of this. But they never showed them as lax as much as we've seen in this. They were starting to. That obviously, like, the day-to-day garrison commanders aren't fanatics. But this happens in so many real-world revolutions. You know, the revolving door revolution of, and we had our revolution, we had our fascist takeover, and now there's just a different bureaucracy in place that is doing the same things. I mean, was it A New Hope at the Death Star beating of the military commanders are generally shocked? Well, how will we maintain control without the bureaucracy of the Imperial senators? Well, don't worry, we'll replace them with hand-picked military governors. That's also the deleted scene from Revenge of the Sith, where Mon Mothma and Bail Organa are talking about the beginning of the rebellion. That they're reacting to the Emperor just posted a decree saying that there are now direct military governors, the system of Grand Moffs and stuff. Well, what's to stop them from becoming just as corrupt? And I don't mean corrupt as in, ruthless. Obviously, they're willing to kill and use slave labor for the sake of the Empire, but selfishly lining their own pockets and not being particularly good as military governors for the sake of the Empire as a whole. That this is a historical problem, and you wonder, well, then how do they have paradoxically, such a tight grip on the populace and still be bumbling bureaucrats? Well, unfortunately, that happens in real life. The thing I think of is with the Nazis, there was a widespread stereotype, still is, that they had a really efficient government. No, they did not. The Nazis were simply more willing to kill. It wasn't particularly competent or efficient, that when you are willing to kill thousands of your own people, to steal their private property, to seize their bank accounts, of course you're going to get money really fast. Sorry, there's this whole you ever seen that Star Trek episode infamously where there's this Nazi planet, and that Kirk and Spock, it's the more Kirk and Spock dress up in Nazi uniforms, they get the ranks all wrong, to infiltrate it. That the idea is, in universe, there's this historian who thought, well, the Nazis were evil, but the structure of their state was so efficient. Look at how they managed to pull their defeated, shattered country, the burden with war reparations and then the Great Depression, how within a handful of years they turned it into the biggest war machine on the planet. Look how efficient they were, so I'm going to rebuild it on this planet here. And then they turned on him. No, the system is flawed. But even so, that you see, like in that Star Trek episode, there was this myth of the Nazis being really efficient. Structurally efficient, when you kill that many people, you're going to get blood money. In terms of their structural organization, they had these infamous inter-service rivalries that Hitler put in place on purpose to make sure that no one organization within the Nazi state could rival him in power. And this warped belief that, well, they're competing against each other, the best ones, the most ruthless ones will rise to the top, it'll keep them from turning on me. Well, it also hamstringed your own economy. That you've got the Department of the 5-Year Plan competing with the military and the Gauleiters and stuff. There is a civilian government that's still appointed. Those just rival administrative staffs. And then the army rivaling the Air Force, and then just the different major leaders within the Nazi state. If you were to make an organizational chart, it would be gibberish. That in terms of that their left hand frequently didn't know what their right hand was doing. That they were seizing resources between different rival projects, that in terms of an objective organizational efficiency, it was just a hodgepodge of things that really was both, like, Hermann Goering was, for a time, the largest steel magnate on the planet, that he was lining his pockets with all this money from the war steel industry, that they were stealing artwork money. They were not just ruthlessly dedicated to the state. So this is an interesting thing with the historians, that the Nazis, just because they were authoritarian, doesn't mean it was efficient. To look at an example from communism, look at North Korea. North Korea is not, well, it's not really communist, it's practically just a hermit kingdom. It's a kingdom. It's a dictatorship. It isn't a model of efficiency, but you see, like, the Kim family in all these palaces with all this money that is not going to the state, that they are just, it's a kleptocracy, basically, that just the money they're stealing. So it is a real-life paradox that I like that they nonetheless managed to show in this. And I know it's confusing. It is confusing in real life that the Empire didn't fix the core problems of the Old Republic. They're more ruthless. They're willing to kill. They're willing to enslave the Wookiees to use as slave labor. They're willing to do random prisoner sweeps, to just round up people for jaywalking to use them as prison labor. Doesn't mean they are intelligent. They're willing to expend lives more. But they are, in Chernobyl, the Soviet Union, the fact that you are willing to expend people's lives like that doesn't make you smarter or willing to accept your own flaws. That they go, we're going to send hundreds of thousands of liquidators to risk getting cancer and stuff by scrubbing down the Chernobyl area in the exclusion zone. They're willing to risk people's lives when it comes to, at the end, confronting the emergency brake trigger in this type of reactor has an inherent design flaw. You need to redesign all of them. They won't admit that. They're willing to get people killed, but they're not willing to address their own internal problems. So it's a paradox, but you see that when any idiocracy, or bureaucracy, corporatocracy, fascism, whatever, when you see people who are both, like Catch-22, that you're both this bumbling bureaucracy and ruthless doesn't make you intelligent. or able to address outside problems. That we see that with, case in point, the Aldani garrison commander. Is this, they're hitting us over the head with it, but it needs to be a point made that he's this visibly fat, corrupt guy who doesn't really care about the local planet. He just wants a promotion to a better posting by impressing a superior. Their garrison is actually really lax in terms of their security, that once they figure out the patrols, it's not that hard to get in. And when the rebels actually do attack the Aldani base to steal the quarterly payroll, it's a distribution sector for whole sector. There are 7 rebels. 6 actually, because one had to stay behind to work the radio, and visibly they are outnumbered by all of the Imperials in the room, but they have their guns drawn. And for the most part, that you can bully the local Aldani people, there's this religious pilgrimage. You can give them, we'll manipulate them into accepting our government housing resettlement by just making it easier, rather than confronting them. We'll give them fake choices in the system. When they're actually confronted by this external problem of, these aren't people we're giving a stick and carrot anymore who are oppressed workers, there are rebels here pointing guns at me, it just does not compute. They have no idea how to deal with an external problem like that. So when you're dealing with the reality distortion field, I'm thinking of like stuff at like Tesla, Apple, the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos thing, that when you're living in that reality distortion field, as they call it, of we are in the perfect system, nothing can go wrong, you don't prepare for external problems. Or all the self-serving politicians who were saying, there's going to be no coronavirus pandemic, and then really didn't know how to react to it when it was starting, because a failure on this level of our public health system could not happen, therefore didn't. Or climate change, which is something beyond their control, and they can lie about it, they can try the reality distortion, but all this boils down to is the old adage, that old parting shot insult by the defeated, that the instant you idiots run into a problem not of your own making, you will be helpless. That should be the epitaph of any authoritarian system or military-industrial complex, whatever, that thinks it's perfect, that you may have gotten us now, but your belief in your own perfection means that the moment you're faced with something beyond your control, you will lose. Because your thinking is so rigid. Because you're used to manipulating things within your control, you don't know how to react, you don't adapt. Bit of a rant there, but just the thought of that, no, systems will fail, that they replaced one system with another, that it's this, they don't know how to react to an external problem. So I know this is meandering around, but the point Nemec makes about the system is rigid and flawed and will inherently collapse, all the points tying in with Stellan Skarsgård's Chernobyl show that you believe you're perfect, this is going to happen, that they won't allow or respond to failure. Which brings me to the other part of this, and this is the last part of point 5 here. That was just the local bumbling garrison commanders. Think about the ISB, the Imperial Intelligence Bureau, the Security Bureau, who are actually specifically charged with being the intelligence service that seeks out and identifies threats to the Empire. These aren't punch-clock garrison commanders. They are trying to figure out, are there rebel movements? Even they have internal rivalries. As opposed to just, I want to line my pockets with wealth and get a better posting like the garrison commander, it's Miro is competing with one of the other lieutenants for jurisdiction. They're still competing for power. Even the ones who are efficient are still competing against each other rather than the common enemy. So there's this problem that Miro keeps running into, that she's actually good at her job, and for once, her boss, Major Partagaz, is a reasonable authority figure who is good at his job and listens to his subordinates and criticizes them for not thinking outside the box. That you can get the sense this is a guy who actually knows how to run an intelligence agency. And Major Partagaz is played by Qyburn from Game of Thrones. He's a good actor. He's been in a lot of stuff. I like seeing him. that when she points out the rebels are hopping state lines, they don't care about lines on a map, that even the Imperial Security Bureau, who is a little ahead of the curve, by the end of the season, they need results. That they need to show we caught someone, and they do, that one of the other off-screen rebel cells. And Miro is annoyed. She says, we were supposed to catch the big fish. We were supposed to catch Axis, Stellan Skarsgård's Luthen. And we settled for the low-level guy. Well, the bosses want results, and they want it fast, and they're impatient because the system is supposed to be perfect and work immediately. And that is very much like The Wire. That was a big thing on The Wire when you talked about this, that we're catching the street-level people to make it look like we're getting results, because no one wants to admit how big of a task it's going to be to root out the head of this snake. That everyone's looking for a quick fix instead of we're settling in for a long-term problem that'll take like 2 years to figure out who all the rebel leaders are, and then we wipe them out in one fell swoop. They won't do that. They won't settle for that. It's, we'll be out of Vietnam by Christmas. We'll be out of Afghanistan by next year, rather than accept it's going to take 5 years to do this. And you kind of, there comes a point where the local people, they said this, that they were sending us good reports that things were going well. They were telling you what you wanted to hear, rather than say, actually, the local politicians are pretty corrupt, and it'll take at least 5 years and a lot of effort to do what we're trying to do. It's just quick fixes to things because, well, we're perfect. Everything works great. And that is the major thematic point that Miro outright states in one of the big scenes with, this is when Yularen is in there. The colonel who outranks her boss is Major Partagaz. His boss, Yularen, who's high up enough that he can personally talk to the Emperor about this. In her big meeting with him, she says, it turns out a wide-scale, galaxy-wide problem is that local sector commanders don't report their failures because they don't want us to punish them. It is exactly like the Chernobyl thing, that whenever something goes wrong, they just don't report on it, so we have this belief of our own perfection because they know what we would kill them if they were letting this stuff happen, rather than that there is no margin of error. Means that it's all like the Catch-22 stuff, that when there's no margin for error, people will tune out the problems that are inherent to this artificial system. I hope all of that makes sense. I know this is a rant, but big ideas here, just whoa, that they're actually verbalizing this. Miro saying, it's like The Wire, that the local level people just tell us everything is going well. And he'll even throw us a few local level rebels now and again and act like they're making real progress, or just not report thefts and things. We are not making progress, and we're the intelligence arm, and we didn't even notice this for a long time. And they even have their own internal rivalries. It's a serious problem. And even Partagaz, who is an intelligent person, has to lament her in the last episode. We needed to show some results. So we went with the quick fix, and I know that Axis is Luthen is still out there, but it's what we got to do. So it's this bittersweet note. They managed to get one rebel cell. It feels like a failure. The rebels actually feel like, we tricked the Empire into making a crackdown. Some progress has been made. There is hope at the end of the episode, at the end of season 1, that he's back with Luthen's group. He's escaped. The rebellion is ongoing. They figured out some of their money stuff for the moment. That just the fragility of systems and institutions. Just, these are people who love The Wire, like YouTube algorithm, the Netflix algorithm for HBO Max, that if you liked Andor, you will like The Wire. This is the best show ever, except for maybe Breaking Bad. Family Guy joke. It's just the whole thing. If you treat people like cogs in a machine, and to keep their head down and focus on self-preservation, you'll at best get loyalty based on fear, but not true enthusiasm or competence. In closing, it reminds me of something from the seminal Timothy Zahn Thrawn trilogy, the Heir to the Empire Thrawn trilogy from the 90s, big thing that started the real wave of the Legends continuity. In that Thrawn, in the Heir to the Empire books, there's a point where they're trying to catch Luke in his X-Wing on a mission, and the tractor beam, he escapes by firing his proton torpedoes while reversing in such a way that the tractor beam locks onto the torpedoes and the hyperspace out of there. This happens twice. First time, the tractor beam officer just tries to lay the blame on someone else, that he was just robotically, I tried to fire the tractor beam at him, it didn't work, he did something to outmaneuver it and I didn't know what to do because my thinking is so rigid. And not only is he not thinking competently, he tries to lay the blame on other people. And Thrawn executes him on the spot. Well, he has his bodyguard do it. Second time, the tractor beam officer thinks on his feet, thinks outside the box. He tries something else with the tractor beam, something else, a spur of the moment to try to lock onto Luke's thing. That almost works, but Luke manages to slip away again. But at least he did something, and it almost worked, and he acknowledges this is and rather than say, well, everything is perfect, tractor beams, that's how they work, when Thrawn confronts him, this guy knows he executed the last guy, he just honestly tells him, he did A, I did B, so he did C, so I did D. These are the steps I tried to do, I thought outside the box, it's still an ongoing problem of how do we stop someone from slipping through a tractor beam like that. And Thrawn promotes him on the spot because he was actually thinking and admitting his error. He was admitting this was my failure in face of a challenge, and I was thinking of some ways to try to address it. And I'm still thinking of some things we could do, and I'm not just giving up. Instead of thinking we are perfect. And that's why Thrawn is someone I would follow to the gates of hell and back. He made us proud to wear the Imperial uniform. He did, not like all these warlords. But that's all neither here nor there. I've talked about Thrawn before. But as for the rank and file of, because he's not really an Imperial, he's a Chiss. But point is just the flawed system falling upon itself. And they really show that. Just, this isn't, we blew up a Death Star, or we hit their power reactor, or the light and dark sides of the Force. It's, the Empire is rigid enough that all they're doing is like what Leia said, you're clenching your fist, more planets slip through your fingers. That this isn't smart, blowing up planets, the Gorman Massacre, and fundamentally your own subordinates are either corrupt or fear you so much that they just don't give accurate reports to you. And this is a galaxy-wide problem. There is no real solution to it at the end of it. It's just galaxy-wide. People don't tell us when parts go missing because rebels stole them. And it's all over the place. To the point they weren't even sure there was an organized rebellion. So how far am I along in this? Whoa, that is almost 2 hours. Well, point 6 and 7 about my review of Andor, apart from waxing philosophical on the, this is a show with themes central to the Star Wars experience that for once they're actually addressing, and not just the more esoteric spiritual stuff of the mystics that when I, like, if Halloween, I don't have good costumes or anything, but when I play a character in Star Wars, or, not really cosplay, select a character to be in, like, a Star Wars MMO. I don't really play MMORPGs, but if I was picking a character, like, I wouldn't be a Force user. I'd be, like, a Grand Admiral or a Moff or something, or even an Akbar level person, or Wedge Antilles in the later Legends books, of the fleet commanders who make decisions on that scale. And it's not the magic stuff, it's not the Mandalorian super soldiers. I don't know if I'd be in the Senate discussing trade regulations, but the politics is what's interesting to me, and the fleet admirals and stuff who then in turn get wrapped up in the politics and stuff. That is what matters. Like, Padme in the prequel trilogy is someone on the ground level who can influence events, or Bail Organa. Bail Organa is another that you're capable of doing that, of just influencing the story. Now, the pretty make for a pretty boring video game. It was debating in the Senate, so I probably go with the fleet commander side of things. But that's more interesting to me, of the policy level stuff, the Thrawn stuff. Of okay, we're going to do this to achieve this. We're going to manipulate this over here, without resorting to magic. I've never really been on board with that. I know a lot of people are, and I don't begrudge them of that. It's just not for me. I was in it for the politics. So that's really the show I would have made. The other 2 points in here are just, this is like one line here. 0.6 out of 7, this is why I buried this. There's a bit more sex in it, but not like R-rated. That just, people made a big deal of this at the time, I don't, that like they acknowledge that people have sex. Like, there's a point where Andor's ex-girlfriend, Bix, she gets on the bed of her current boyfriend and takes her jacket off. She has a shirt on underneath it, but the clear message is she's disrobing off camera, about to have sex with him. Well, they don't, like, show anything. But for people to think, oh, this is for kids and stuff, it's clearly implying, as you would on a 8 p.m. TV show in the United States. This isn't, like, in UK terms, this isn't after the 9 p.m. cutoff. That just even acknowledging that people have sex isn't a thing that I think that the movies ever, like as a joke or something, ever mention. Like, oh yeah, they're banging over there. Oh yeah, he sleeps around a lot. Like, you get the sense that Lando is a ladies' man, but they never really remark on, oh, he slept with half the women here. Like, it's implied, but it's never in dialogue. So it wasn't really enough to define the show. It was just a background thing of, whoa, they actually acknowledge that people have sex in this. But it wasn't, like, fixated on in any way or happened on camera or something. I wouldn't even say it was that sexy, it's just it was matter-of-factly in the background. Yes, people do that. But the real meat of 0.6 here, is the real core of 0.6 here is this is the first time we've had a major LGBT character in Star Wars, which has been a complaint for some time. And I don't think you need to necessarily add in diversity. It doesn't equate to a quality project. You can have a really quality thing without any of that. But it's the fact that fans were complaining for years, and Disney, the corporate system, as it were, was not addressing fan complaints, and like just throw in a gay character here or there in the background. It doesn't need to be that much. That rather than do that, they were dragging their feet. It's their hesitance and incompetence was the most annoying part of it. And then, like in Rise of Skywalker, they have a woman kiss another woman in the background with no dialogue and no prior development, and acted like that was something. Or a video game character in the background or something, and this is tokenism. It doesn't address the fan complaint, nor does it really, that no one is satisfied by this. So it's more their incompetence I was annoyed about, that in terms of their competence in addressing specific fan complaints, wow, they actually listened on this and made a reasonably well-developed LGBT character who was relevant to the plot, but it didn't define them. They introduced a character, Vel Sartha, who is actually played by Faye Marsay from Game of Thrones. She was the waif in Bravos with the Faceless Men. And they explain this pretty quickly. She's actually Mon Mothma's cousin, like her maternal cousin or something. That for a second I thought, oh, she's dressed up like you meet her in the field on the Aldhani mission in tactical gear. And then you think, oh, she's dressed up like a social elite because she's dressed like a rich leading socialite of Coruscant, and she's walking into Mon Mothma's Senate offices. You think, oh, she's infiltrating. And then everyone greets her by name and recognizes her, and you realize this isn't an act. She is this rich girl who moonlights as a rebel because she believes in it. But no, she really is. You meet her out of context that she is from, I don't think it's House Mothma. I don't know how they do it on Chandrilla, but she is an extended family member. And I know they go, oh, remember the new guy. It's logically, Mon Mothma has a family as a member of a powerful aristocratic family. Like in the Legends continuity, she had a daughter, but they move around a little bit. They've rewritten it for this, but Yeah, she has a daughter. She has an arranged marriage because that's common among their aristocrats. Many people have cousins who you don't really remark on it to other people. It kind of happens every day. And that she happens to be in a relationship with another woman who's Cinta, who's this South Asian looking woman. They didn't develop Cinta as much, but that they are a couple and they're alive at the end of the show. Like, out of many other people who either leave or get killed off, that they're still alive at the end and they're just part of Luthen's rebel cell with Andor. And we'll see where that goes. But it was nice seeing that. They don't really remark on it that much. That they just mention in passing, oh, they're together, and there's a point where someone goes, her pompous husband goes, oh, I wonder when you'll find the right man to marry. And she goes, I'm not looking. And Mon Mothma shoots her a knowing glance. But like, I imagine that their attitudes towards that would vary from one planet to the next, or culture to the next, whatever. But it didn't intrude into the story and felt organic. And on top of that, they should have done it even if it was just not well written, because fans have been complaining for years that it's annoying how much that they are failing to address a big complaint. As if, similar to, why aren't there like women doing stuff in this? Like, if you had a show that was not this, I'm talking about other shows where they go, you don't have enough female characters, like comic book things, and they fail to address the problem for years at a time. That this was a problem. Not only did they address it with a relatively major character, it was pretty well written, and it worked in the storyline. It was an interesting character, and what they're trying to do here. Well, actually, it's Mon Mothma's cousin, who's an aristocrat who moonlights as a rebel field commander, was interesting. So good on them that they worked that in, because that was a problem officially for years. Now, I am not LGBT, but I feel bad for that. It was a complaint, just as if it was something like the Ewoks don't blink enough or something, and they ignored it, or there's these continuity errors that you aren't addressing. It shows they don't care about the fans when we're making complaints. Or, we can tell you didn't set up the Palpatine grandchild twist in Rise of Skywalker from an earlier movie. You should have. When they just go, oh, that's the fans complaining. We have legitimate complaints and you don't listen to us. So anytime they address that's a move in the right direction. Point 7 here was just criticisms of things I would have done differently, that I don't think this was the perfect show in terms of in my head, the utter perfection that could be achieved. It's better than anything that's come before. I mean, you could debate whether Mandalorian Season 1 was as good as this or something, because they're different styles of show. But there are a handful of things I would have done differently. Pacing things. Even people who like the show, I've heard, have the same thing, that the first 3 episodes could have basically been one episode. Then again, Disney was smart enough to release all 3 of them on the same day. And a lot of people didn't watch, because for me, the show begins in episode 4. So if you're still listening to this, in my opinion of it, you haven't seen the whole show yet. The show begins in episode 4. You can't skip to it because they're set up. You need to just power through the first 3. That's when Mon Mothma shows up and her storyline begins. That Luthen, after he recruits Andor, he goes to Coruscant, meets with Mon Mothma, and that's when they start switching between the different scale storylines. It's like an entirely different show. That largely these were things I could tell they were setting up for season 2, which will probably have payoff. It's just they don't pay off in season 1, so I felt you should have gotten a running start on this. That the first 3 episodes, they spend showing that as a child, Andor lived on with this tribe of lost children on a planet, and these 2 salvagers from Ferrix rescued him, and his parents on Ferrix were actually his adopted parents. I mean, he's Hispanic, and it's this white woman and black man, Clem, is his father. The Empire hanged him from the public square, but how he met his adoptive parents. You should have put that in somehow to show that, because her funeral is the big event that sparks a riot near the end. But That shouldn't have been. They keep intercutting with these kids who aren't speaking English, Galactic Basic, and you have to just pick up what they're doing. You should have done that for one episode, not for three. That like the final scene of that sequence was enough to carry it, that we're teasing something we're going to show in season 2. That it went on for a little too long, that it confuses the audience when you jump between many storylines like that, and there was one too many. And you could argue it needed to be in there. It's not like it was totally extraneous. It's just it's setting up other things. That the first scene of the series is him going into a city brothel asking if they've seen his sister, who is also from that planet. Never remarked upon again in the entire first season. And I get that this was kind of a prologue, that they're setting up that this is the arc of the series. A major thing is he doesn't know what happened to his sister from the planet that he was on as a child. And it sets up that he and accidentally kills these 2 security guards who were trying to mug him. He didn't need to mention his sister. It could have just been a regular random job. So the entire thing with his sister's background and the intercutting to the planet that much, the first 3 episodes could have been one episode. And a major problem has been they're not hooking people in. The ratings were so low, if you haven't heard of this, that I've heard Red Team review remarking on this. The ratings were so low that over Thanksgiving, Disney decided we need to run these episodes on ABC on broadcast television because we own ABC. Well and good. They only showed the first 2 episodes. Which isn't even, it's an arc that ends with a big shootout in the 3rd episode. You didn't even finish the first story arc, much less that it really starts in the 4th episode. So the first 3 episodes, they do so much time setting up these characters on the scrapyard planet he's on, Ferrix. Well, it's an industrial planet. They spend so much time setting up Ferrix to get you invested with characters that aren't that big for now. And they're important for his life, and thematically it's important, but it was a slow start to this. If I was to rank the episodes, the beginning is too slow. It wasn't bad. It didn't detract from it, and I'm patient enough that I'm waiting for the Mon Mothma scenes, and okay, here they are. I just wish that happened sooner. The other thing is related to this is the Cyril Karn. I keep saying Kyle Katarn. The Cyril Karn storyline was a bit drawn out. It was well acted, it was beautifully acted, and well filmed, and paralleling him with Andor, but you think, oh, he's going to be the Inspector Javert in this, and it's showing it's not. It's how he's someone who believes in the system, even though he's an ant. He's a drone in the system. And he's not an Imperial, he's just a corporate security guard who wants to be an Imperial and thinks he matters. There were just one too many scenes of him with his mother that should have been one scene, and all in one episode, rather than spread out across 3 episodes. This is a thing early Game of Thrones had, before it got even bigger problems, was have the courage to give characters an episode off. That was a big problem we had, because they outright admitted we would invent scenes for characters rather than let them go an episode off. And the scenes were trash. That have the courage to not revisit a storyline if there's nothing to tell for that given episode. It's just, maybe you're trying to show you're paralleling it. I wouldn't remove it, because it did pay off. They're clearly setting something up for season 2, and the narrative parallel between him and Cassian, I get it. I really liked where they're going. It took a while to get there, so they shouldn't have spread the Karn scenes out so much after he's in the first story arc. There's 12 episodes with 4 story arcs. Every 3 episodes is a story arc. They should have put all the Karn scenes together, and they should not have spent so much time on the early Ferrix setup with his background on the planet before his adoptive parents found him, with his sister. Again, not a criticism, just maybe we'll think back on that differently after season 2. But other people than me have already said the one problem with the show is it had a kind of a slow start in the first 3 episodes, which was also unwise, given that unlike Boba Fett or The Mandalorian or Obi-Wan Kenobi, there wasn't as much hype for this project going into it. You need to hook people fast. and they didn't, and they officially have ratings problems. So I would have done some stuff with the pacing there. Episode 4 onward, other than some of the Karn scenes, you should have condensed that. The scenes with Karn from episodes 4 through like 9 out of 12, should have just put all those in episode 10, I think, and that might have worked better. Yeah, it's like a Jenga thing. I probably would have heard everything to move something around, so I'm just probably rambling here. I don't know if we should have changed anything in the long run. And the other thing is, I would have taken out the one space battle thing where Luthen escapes by launching countermeasures at a tractor beam, then shoots down 2 TIE fighters. Maybe just the tractor beam part without the TIE fighters, just so they could claim there aren't even space battles in this. Though, as I later found out, that was actually a cameo by, I love it when they cameo old starship designs from, like, unused concept art, that the ship, picket ship getting him was the Cantwell class. That's from something. So, that was a cameo. That's fun. But I would have left that out to just show how much of this is about the politics and the fighting is off screen, because it matters more. So that's my 7-point review of this, and yes, it is arguably the TV show of the year, because can you really classify House of the Dragon or Sandman as TV shows? They're adaptations of things that don't really fit the TV format very well. Even Sandman, was barely contained by the format of comic books and graphic novels. It transcended it. House of the Dragon is this giant, sprawling story that's it's presented in TV, but it's not really meant to be TV. So please, if you haven't seen it, check it out, and please leave your comments on this. I will try to respond to all of them. Arguably the show of the year, it deserves all the nominations, and my only fear is will he be able to keep up this level of quality.